Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. Special thanks to Lord Deben for joining us and sharing some of his time with us. Very busy man. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get underway. This is either the 11th or the 12th Wednesday webinar that we've run during the lockdown. It's a series that's, at a tough time for everybody. We've tried to offer those of us who love sport and care about sport and work in sport and are passionate about sustainability, the opportunity to talk about the issues, to share ideas, share perspectives, and to really keep that conversation going. And in that spirit, we've invited Lord Deben, who's obviously, you'll all know, a very prominent figure in this respect, to share his thoughts and his perspectives with us, I think, generally in terms of where the country's going in relation to these issues, but also specifically for sport. Just a little bit of housekeeping, a little bit of business from me. Just so you know, all of the webinars and uploaded to our YouTube channel, and they'll be on our website by the end of this week, so you can watch back any that you've missed. Or you can watch them as many times as you want because it's such good content. As you all know, we're running a consultation for how sport can build back better, very much inspired by the work of the Committee on Climate Change and that Lord Deben can tell us about. The link will be available. I think Anna's going to post it in the chat. There it is now, and we'll send it round as ever after this webinar. And then just a little bit on the format of today. It's going to be a little bit different, a little bit more of a managed discussion. I'm going to kickstart, or do my best to kickstart a discussion with Lord Deben, but hand the floor over to him for as much as possible, because that's where the value will be. Every now and again, I might invite Russ, who's the CEO of Basis, just to share a few thoughts and perspectives. But really, it's an opportunity for us all to hear from and learn from Lord Deben. So to that end, I would encourage you all to use the Q&A and the chat function. If in the second half of this discussion you have a question that you'd like to ask and you want to speak on video to Lord Deben and ask him a question, then please post it in the Q&A bit of the kind of panel at the bottom of your screen. And if you've got an issue you'd like to raise, but you'd prefer either myself or Russ to kind of weave it into the discussion, then please just use the chat. And the chat is also there for people to kick ideas around themselves, as always. And it's always been a really vibrant part of the webinars that we've run. But that's enough from me for now. I'm going to introduce Lord Deben. Lord Deben, would you like me to introduce you, or would you like to introduce yourself?
Depends which will be the shorter, and I think I'll be the shorter. I'm the chairman of the Climate Change Committee. I've been that for 6 years. That's appointed independently by the First Minister of Scotland and Wales, and the First Minister of the North of Ireland, and the Minister responsible for climate change in the English government. And so as I was appointed by a Welsh socialist, a Scottish nationalist, a Protestant unionist in the north of Ireland, and a Liberal Democrat minister in the coalition government, they got a Conservative and a Catholic, so they got a fairly independent figure. That's my job. I have a team of people on the committee. They are all scientists or economists of international repute, and we have a secretariat of people working, young, very bright people working to give us the information that we need. And we're established under an Act of Parliament. And before I did this job, I set up a business which helps people with sustainability all over the world. We've been going for 22 years now. And before that, I was the Secretary of State for the Environment, and earlier the Minister of Agriculture. There we are.
Quite a thin CV then. Thank you for the introduction. We have quite a few people from various different parts of the sporting landscape with us on today's call. Lots of people who are operational in sport, who, while aware of the committee, wouldn't necessarily know the exact remit of it. Would you just be able to spend a couple of minutes just describing exactly what the committee is constituted to do and how you do it?
Well, the committee was set up under the Climate Change Act, And the Climate Change Act is an interesting act because it was an all-party act. It was invented by the Conservative Party in opposition, who got all the other opposition parties to agree to it. It was written by a mixture of politicians and friends of the earth. And then they went to the government and said, well, we've got 100 Labour members who are going to support this. So we'd much prefer you to take it over as a government, because it was a Labour government at the time, because we don't want this to be a party political thing. We want it to be the whole of Parliament. And that's what happened. The whole of Parliament voted. There were 8 people who voted against. Same 8 people, those who are still alive, don't believe in climate change, but the rest of us voted for it. And as a result, we set up the Climate Change Committee. And the job of the Climate Change Committee is to help the government to deliver what we have to do in order to combat climate change. Now, the big problem about climate change is really one of timing. Climate change means that we have to keep on with our programme year in, year out, because you can't do everything at once. You have to have a proper programme. But democracy means that every 4 or 5 years, you have to renew the mandate or remove the mandate of the current government. So how do you put these two things together? How do you have a continuity of policy, but still recognise that government's going to change? So what the Act did was to set up an independent committee, all of whom, except the chairman, are scientists and economists. Chairman is somebody chosen who's supposed to be good at chairing committees. The first one was an economist. I suppose my expertise is in agriculture and the countryside. And our job is to chair this meeting of real experts. And first of all, we have to set the budgets, which the country has to keep to if it's going to end up with what is now the target, which is net zero by 2050. When we started, it was 80% reduction in emissions, but it's now net zero. And we set these budgets well in advance. So it's a pretty good way of making sure that politicians aren't thinking about the immediate future, but really seriously thinking about the future. So the next budget, which we will set, because we've already done the 5th carbon budget, the next budget that we will set will be the 6th carbon budget, and that will take us towards the end of the 2030s. So we'll be nearly, not much short of 12 years before we have to get to our net zero target. And we will draw that up, and it will be presented, as each of the other 5 budgets have been presented, to Parliament. And Parliament then votes on it. So the democratic voice decides whether this budget, which has been presented by the independent committee of experts, is acceptable. And when it has voted, it then can't change it. This is a crucially important part, because if Parliament were allowed to change it, then every time it got difficult, it would push it off. That's the trouble. We push everything off to 2050 and then wake up on 2049 and find we haven't done anything. So the great point about our system is that we know where we're going, we know the steps we have to take, and as a result, we've actually met the first 2 and will meet the 3rd carbon budget. We're not doing so well on the 4th and 5th, and that's the pressure on the government, because now by law it has got to meet that. And if it doesn't, then of course it could be taken to court and forced to. In the meantime, in order for people to know what's happening, every June, the Climate Change Committee produces a report on what the government has done, or whether it is on track, what it needs to do to get on track, and any changes in the scientific advice which we need to give. We've just actually published our 2020 report, rather a special one because it's in the middle of COVID-19, and we were pretty light on the government in the sense of saying, well, you haven't achieved what you should have achieved this year, but we understand there are some pretty good reasons, certainly towards the end of it. This is what you need to do in order to make emergence from the emergency of COVID, also a means of reducing our emissions and fighting climate change. Happily, these two things go together. If we're going to emerge properly from the problems of COVID, then we're going to have to invest in new jobs. The best way to do that is to get people to deal with the insulation in houses, reduce the emissions because we've got warmer houses. That's something that can be done all over the country. Poorer parts even more than the richer parts, because they're the people who suffer most from high energy bills. And secondly, we said we've got to bring forward the date in which we have only sell electric cars to 2032. And we've also said that we've got to ensure that every year there's a higher proportion of those electric cars sold as a principle. Otherwise, we won't get to all electric cars by 2032. And then we've said to the government, you must make the best of the good things that have come out of this terrible disaster, COVID. The fact is, a lot of people want to continue to work for at least part of the week at home. You should help them to do that. You should make provision of broadband more important than building new roads. Spend some of that road money on building a broadband system, which means that anybody anywhere in the country can join in without having to go somewhere else. And then you reduce travel, you reduce commuting, you reduce emissions, and you also give people a much better work-life balance. And then if we are going to have that, then let's also help people to walk and cycle. More cycle lanes, more walking routes in places where it's difficult to get across roads and in and out of towns. All those things to improve what we are doing now in a way which creates jobs, provides people with secure employment, and reduces our emissions. And then we have to do some further work in the future. Immediately, we should be investing more on carbon capture and storage. That's taking the carbon out of fossil fuels where we need fossil fuels. And that's a very good way of creating jobs, particularly in the northeast, where jobs are scarce. And then there's the question of the hydrogen economy, where we're not doing enough to create the conditions in which hydrogen can be used. Hydrogen is extremely good for not emitting CO2 when it comes to being used. But unfortunately, making it at the moment involves a whole lot of use of fossil fuels. So we need to find a way through electrolysis or something of that sort. We have to find a way of being able to create the hydrogen in a very low carbon intensity way. So those are the things that we've said to the government that we now ought to do.
And just in terms of thank you for that explanation. I think it's helpful for everybody, including for me, and I'm supposed to know about this stuff as part of my day. But in terms of the influence of this committee, so when you talk about ending the combustion engine and needing to transition to electric vehicles, and then the government publishes a road to zero strategy, which talks about exactly that. And when you say at the end of June that we need to bring forward a home insulation programme on a massive scale that needs to be weighted towards the poorest, and then about an hour and a half ago, the Chancellor stands up in the House of Commons and announces exactly that. You can draw a line, a fairly direct line between the advice for your committee based on the science, based on the expertise and policy that comes out of ministers' mouths.
Well, yes, I mean, there's no point in having an independent committee if you then ignore it. And indeed, this process whereby, because it becomes law once Parliament has passed it, this process is very effective because it means the government knows it's got to do it. And it knows it can't get out of it, because the only way to get out of it would be to repeal the Climate Change Act. And it manifestly doesn't have a majority of any kind to do that. It wouldn't be able to do that in either House of Parliament, nor would governments of any political party. So in this sense, it makes it much easier to be independent if you're chairman of the Climate Change Committee, because any government having accepted these things, has actually got to implement the work. But I have to say that Rishi Sunak has shown himself to be very much aware of these matters. Because I've been doing this and previous ones, I haven't yet heard the details of what he said. I've only got what people told me was going to happen. But we are at this moment as a committee being briefed. The fact of the matter is that he very soon after becoming Chancellor was at pains to say personally and directly, look, I accept all this. I mean, I understand we've got to do these things. And I have confidence in him, and I have confidence in the opposition too. I have absolutely no doubt that Keir Starmer is absolutely committed to what we're wishing to do, and as is the Liberal Democrat Party. And of course, the Nationalist parties have been particularly good at it. Scotland has done better than the rest of the United Kingdom under the Scottish Nationalist government. And in Wales, the Labour Party in power and the support of the Welsh nationalists has been extremely good. And now we've got a government in the north of Ireland. We shall see. They certainly have committed themselves, and the arrangements under which they resumed their devolved government certainly insist upon them taking the proper steps. So I think we're going to see a period of great change. The trouble, Dom, is very simple. It is we have to do it quickly. The trouble is that we find it so hard to be brave and say, we're going to do this now, and we're going to do it on a continuous basis, and we're not going to fiddle about with it. And the perfect is not going to be the enemy of the best, which is so often the case. We're not going to say, well, we've done it this way for 2 years. We think we've got a better way of doing it now, so nobody knows where they are. We've got to get onto that absolutely clear sense of direction, which is what I hope this government will now do.
That's interesting. I mean, in a number of ways, but there's 2 points in particular there that I think it feels relevant to me in the sporting context. The first is about the political consensus that exists, at least on the need to tackle the problem and what the problem is, if not on the exact detail of the solution. Because actually, when, occasionally when we've worked with, for example, a Premier League club which has a pretty good sustained programme, for example, it's powered 100% by renewable energy and has, zero waste to landfill. And we're trying to encourage that club to talk about these issues to their fans, to the public, to the people who they can connect with and influence. There's often a reluctance to do it, partly because it's felt that these issues are too political. And actually, what we're hearing is that this is an issue or a set of issues on which there's probably more political consensus than any other issue or many other issues. So it's kind of a safe space. And I think secondly, and linked to that, and certainly to the willingness of some of the bigger players in sport to talk about these issues, is where it fits within their priorities. And you were talking about, we've got to do it quickly and we've got to be in it for the long term. And actually, if you're a Premier League football club that's fighting for survival, then really you're not bothered about the future of the planet. You're bothered about staying up that season. And the reason that I mention this is that in your role with Sancroft, you work alongside some pretty big business on a global scale, and in your role with the committee, you advise politicians right at the top of government. And I just wonder if you can imagine yourself in a conversation with the CEO of the Premier League or the owner of a Premier League club, who is, they have the integrity of their sporting competition and their objectives as a team, as a league, in the forefront of their minds. What argument would you use, or where would you start in terms of talking points to persuade them that sustainability and tackling climate change was something that they needed to take as seriously as their day-to-day priorities as a club or as a competition?
Well, of course, when I'm dealing with people with Sancroft, I don't deal with climate change. I deal with sustainability as a whole, and specifically put the climate change thing on one side because I don't want to be conflicted in that. Because I do actually think that sustainability is really the key to this. partly because I've taken very strongly on board the words of the Pope in the encyclical Laudato Si, when he makes the important point, which is that the issue of climate change is the symptom of what we've done to the world. The climate is changing because of what we've done to the world. And what's more important, perhaps, than concentrating on climate change, although that is an absolutely crucial thing, is to look at what it is that has caused that climate change and how we deal with it. Now, if I'm talking to, and I have actually, as you know, talked very often to chief executives of Premier League clubs, and we work with one, what I'm saying to them is, why do you think that every major business has taken sustainability seriously? And even those who didn't take it seriously a year ago are now taking it seriously. And what's more, every investor is beginning to take it seriously. I mean, the big change, actually, Dom, is the way in which investors are thinking about it. I mean, a year ago, even just a year ago, when Sancroft needed to get investors to think about sustainability, you used to have to go and fight them. You had to go through the arguments, you had to do the. Now they come to us because they recognize that sustainability is best summed up by a comment once made to me by one of our customers, who was the chairman of Coca Cola. And he said to me, look, John, for me, the first part of sustainability is that I want to be here, or my company wants to be here, in 125 years, just like we've been here for 125 years. So the first bit of sustainability is how do I stay in business? And if you're talking to a Premier League football club, the fact is that unless they embrace these issues, they won't stay in business. Because what is sustainability? It's actually making sure you use the least energy possible. It means cutting your water usage. It means protecting your ground from the increasing days of drought. I mean, how does a Premier Football League not think about the fact that we are now going to have, and have had, it's not a question of just the future, but have had very long periods of an awful lot of rain, followed by periods of an awful lot of, I don't know what's happened there. There seems to have been something stuck in front of me, but it isn't me, if you see what I mean. I don't know what's happened. But then followed by a long period of drought. So how on earth do you, how on earth can you deal with these things unless you think seriously about it? So the way in which you water your grounds, the way in which you drain your grounds, the way in which you think about how do we deal not just with drought, but with very large downpours. What about our new stadium? What about our new any new buildings, anything that we're doing new, anything that we're refurbishing? How do we do that in a way which is more sustainable? Because that's the only way we reduce our overheads, we spend less, and also we protect ourselves from government intervention. Now, you know, I was 16 years a minister. I have to say the one thing you don't want is ministerial intervention, because they always get it wrong. So what you want to do is to make sure you've done it right in the first place, and not get landed with the kind of rules and regulations which we are bound to have, because the government has got to obey the law, the government's got to deliver this, and if we don't do it voluntarily, then the government will interfere. I don't want the government telling Premier League clubs what they should do with their stadiums. That if they want to build a new one, they've got to do it in this way or that way. I want them to do it in the best way, because that is the best way for their future. And if the chief executive isn't convinced, I'd say, well, what's really different between your business and Unilever, your business and Microsoft, your business, and then you can go through most of the world's major successful businesses, and you see they all accept this. Didn't accept it in the past, but do now. And even businesses that are threatened, their very being is threatened by the change from fossil fuels, like BP, they get it too. And so I would say to the chief executive, I don't understand what it is. Oh, I found what it is. It's a fly. It's a fly which keeps on walking over the over where the little eye looks at me. And so it's not an unusual thing. After all, we all know Premier League clubs are businesses. They want to win football matches because they're a business. That's what the whole thing's about. So the same rules apply, and you can take advice from these people and see how to do it.
Okay, so you've won the argument about why it should be important. So the next question that the CEO, and it could be a cricket club, it could be a golf club, it could be anything. Where do we start? So where's the right place? And the reason that I ask these questions is that a long-running theme of something that's come up regularly during these webinars is that there are people who are, operational on sustainability, who are, operating at quite a senior level, but who still find it difficult to persuade their organisation to take it as seriously as they need to, partly because of the first question, why it should be a priority, but partly because that need to make a compelling case of where to start is quite difficult. And if you were to advise either a sustainability professional trying to win an argument internally or directly the decision maker in an organisation where they should start their thought process on this stuff, could you give us an indication of what that would be?
Well, I always start where the money is, because I think unless it's unless it's going to contribute to the profitability of the business, people won't go on doing it. So I'm not ashamed of starting where the money is. So if I were working with as we are, as I say, working with a major sporting institution or a football club or a cricket club, I'd start off with looking at what they are doing and how you can improve what they're doing to make them more sustainable, but also to save them money. You start there because you've got to prove things to people. And I always start with how do I prove this to the chief financial officer, because that's where it really starts. So it's rather like what's happened with COVID. The people who are going to be our biggest sustainability advocates are the finance directors, because they're going to say, well, it is better if the office staff does 3 days out of 4 or 5 days at home, because I don't have to pay for the electricity and I don't have to pay for the heating, and I can have half the number of space in the offices once we get out of social distancing. So it's very obvious. And people are going to say, well, I prefer to work at home for 3 out of 5 days because I don't have to commute, and therefore I don't have to pay that money. So I'm quids in too. So you start with the money is. And with a sporting body, you look through what they're spending their money on. And when you get past the people, what are they spending money on? Well, they're spending money on heating the place. They're spending money on watering. They're spending money on a whole range of things of that sort. And there are very clear ways in which you can change that. The second thing I always look for is, where are they going to change anyway? Because the best way to do these things is in the normal course of business. It's always cheaper to do it that way, and not to wait until you're forced to do it by governments or forced to do it because your fans expect it. And so you look at the business plan and see what they're intending to do, and you help them to use that plan. So they're not spending any more money, but they're just doing it in the right way, which saves them more money. And then thirdly, I remind them that this is really part of their relationship with their fans, because more and more people are getting worried about these issues. More and more people care about these issues, care about waste, worried about the oceans, really determined to feel that they do want to fight climate change, all those things. I think a football club or a cricket club or a tennis club, whatever it is, I think they will increasingly be pressurized by not only their fans, but by lots of their players. And they will be saying, what are you doing about it? Why can't I have kit which is made from recycled material? Why are we wasting money on this and that and the other? That's what they're going to ask. And the clubs that get ahead of that will be the clubs which will benefit most. And the last thing in sport that I want to say to people is that most of the decent people in sport have a real feeling about the leadership which they're giving to the younger generation. We know perfectly well that it's the football team that reaches out to them. It's the cricket team, if that's what they really care about. And because they want that, they're quite tough about the behaviour of their players and such like, and they want them to be, they want them to be icons. That's part of the deal. This is an area where increasingly people will look to sports leadership and will form their view about sports leadership by the way that they behave. And we all know what damage it does to a team if there is a night out which ends up in disaster. I think it's going to be increasingly damaging if they're not leading on things like waste and battles against climate change and keeping the oceans clear of plastic. And that's what people will be looking for.
I think that's the strong sentiment that's come through as part of these discussions. And actually, there's not a lot of data about kind of exactly what fans think about their club's performance or what they want from the clubs, but it does exist, I think, massively reinforces that third point about what supporters and stakeholders will expect from within sport. I've got one more question.
Can I just say one thing? I mean, the fans are, after all, ordinary, normal people for the most part. In normal circumstances, they are ordinary, normal people. And so it's worth saying that the pressure on government and the pressure on every other institution from customers and voters is growing and growing. I mean, can you imagine a political party that got up today and said, I'm not going to fight climate change, I don't believe in sustainability, I think you can all go hang because it doesn't matter? Nobody'd be elected on that basis. I mean, they would in America, but that's very true. But in Britain, they would not be elected. And similarly, what firm? Can you imagine a major company that said to its customers, well, we don't care about our staff and their vulnerabilities, and we don't care about that our product is littering the seas. Of course, they're not saying that. They're saying the opposite. They're saying we're going to reduce the amount of chemicals we use. We're going to reduce the amount of plastic. We're going to do that. Why are they doing that? Not because necessarily they're led by great philosophers, although some of them are. But they're doing it because they know that their profitability depends on their doing it. And these are the same people who are on the terraces in the stadium on a Saturday. And so don't kid yourself. You don't need to ask the fans, you just have to ask the people.
I take your point about football and sports fans being ordinary people, but I'm not sure the behaviour is exactly the same on a Saturday afternoon for the rest of the week. I do have a couple more questions, but I'm keen that we bring in as many people as possible. And I think, given the points that you were just making about where you would start this conversation, I'll at this point just to bring in Russell, if I can, who's our CEO. But I think you will have met before. Russell was the first sustainability manager in British sport and was responsible for the transformation in sustainability terms of World's Cricket Ground. Russ, when you started that conversation from scratch effectively, and I'd just be interested in which elements of what Lord Deben said were the most decisive in you winning that argument. Lord's, pioneering the changes that they did, which were, obviously showed leadership within cricket, but I think within British sport and really sport around the world.
I do agree completely that you need to be targeting the finance side of things. If I'm completely honest, it didn't sit well with me personally. I'm really an advocate for people understanding environmental impacts and the fact that with no world, there is no sport. If you really do severe damage and serious damage, it causes significant problems. But you are in a business environment, so you do need to make sure there's the business case. But the business case does need to go hand in hand with kind of that moral side of things as well. I think you've got to have somewhat of an emotional connection with this, or at least an understanding that there is something beyond the business case. But nobody's going to do it if it's going to cost huge amounts of money. I think that's just an unfortunate fact. But you've definitely got to get the finance side of things sorted out. And then the operational side, there was always, I typically found there was good support, but then there was an operational pushback in terms of, but this is going to change things significantly. It's going to change the way we do things. And look, that's just human nature. You know, people get comfortable and you want to stick with the way that you do things. So there is a lot of legwork that you need to do to make significant changes within any major organisation. But for the finances and the operational side, but I always try to put in the moral and emotional attachment to the natural world and what we're doing to it.
Which is part of the power of sport, right? So it's the ability to make that connection on a number of levels. And I'm just linking what you've just said, Russ, and your experience of it, and back to Lord Deben, the fact that you've had a number of these conversations in sport. I know that you've spoken to the RNA about their sustainability program, and like you say, a number of conversations in football. Can you think of or identify one or two projects or one or two initiatives within sport that stand out to you at the moment, and that give you some hope that if they're adopted across either professional or grassroots sport in the UK, that they can actually start to transform things and build a much more sustainable culture around the whole industry?
Well, clearly there's been a lot of improvement in a number of areas. I mean, if you look at the average golf club today, they are being much more sensible about water usage, about the way they look after the land which they have. I mean, we've got a long way to go, but it certainly is much better than it was. And your own work in cricket and getting people to understand the effect on games, of actually playing games, of the increase in heat, have made people think much more seriously about how they shall organise cricket in the future, and what wherever development is going to take place, taking all that into account. So I mean, I think there's a good deal to be seen across the board. A number of football clubs, I think, have done extremely well. If you look at some of the new stadia, they really are very much better than they have been. I'm very much involved with Everton. They've got plans for a new stadium that will be sustainable in a way which is really remarkable. If you look at the other end of the scale, if you like to see the novel all wood stadium that is being built by someone who comes out of the electricity industry, and he owns a very much smaller football club, and they're going to have the most sustainable stadium, although a small one, that there has ever been. Well, these are really good steps, and they were not steps that were being taken a few years ago. And if you go into, if you take the half dozen stadiums that have been built of recent years, latest ones, I think you'll find a degree of sustainability that you would never have seen before. So people are thinking about it, and they're thinking about it effectively. I think the problem is, to come back to Russ, the reason I don't start with the moral issue, they know I'm going to come like that. They say it's him again. So I have to start with the fact that I come out of business. And before I was a politician, I ran a reasonably large company for other people, and I worked my way up from the bottom, and that's what I did. And I know very well that unless you can establish your business credentials, unless you can establish that you understand that people have got to pay the wages at the end of the month, and unless you can understand that, then they won't listen to you in any other way. When you've got past that, then it is important to show your enthusiasm and to show your passion for the matter, because we ought to be passionate about the things that we do, and particularly in sport. And it seems to me that that's the nexus that you've got somehow to get hold of. But they are much more likely to be suspicious of your business intentions than they are of your moral intentions, because I'm afraid, well, not afraid, I'm pleased that we show our moral position on these from day to day, Russ, where I know perfectly well where you're coming from, but you've got to prove to me that I'm not going to lose money by following you. That's, I'm afraid, the big issue.
Yes, and completely understood, and I do take that on board. At my core, I'm very much an environmentalist, but can I actually breach or ask a question and come back to what you were saying about the finances and the profitability, etc. I wonder where the committee sits in terms of, it seems that a lot of the carbon accounting that we do in the UK doesn't account for offshoring and moving our carbon overseas. How do you actually account for that? Because some people will say that our carbon isn't coming down as quickly if you take into account everything that we're getting made overseas, that our companies are making overseas, because it's a better margin for them. Do you take account of that? And how does the UK government take that on board?
Well, the Climate Change Committee does it in three ways. I mean, first of all, the reason that we account for it in what are called production emissions, in other words, the emissions you make in this country itself, is because that's the international way of doing it, because otherwise you'll have double counting. So you've got to decide, and only we have control over those. I mean, it's no good saying, well, we're buying this from China. You don't have any control over the Chinese rules for making these things. So you want to start with the things over which you've got control. So that's why we express everything in production emissions, because internationally that's the comparator, and because it's the one that you've got control. And if you're asking the government to do things, it's got control over that. But secondly, we have regularly produced the consumption emissions, and we've done it again this year, and we're going to do it more regularly, in fact, in the future. What it shows is that our production emissions have fallen very considerably. Our gross national product has increased very considerably at the same time. So it shows these two aren't linked, as the doomsayers said, you know, that if you reduce your emissions, then you'll reduce your prosperity. You don't. It's not true at all. But even our consumption emissions have been falling, not as fast. That is absolutely true. And then the third thing we do is to check whether there really is any offshoring. In other words, are there things that people go abroad with because of our rules at home? And frankly, there aren't. There's nothing to any real extent. Part of that is because the government has actually been, under all three parties, both Labour, Conservative and Coalition, has been very good at having a system whereby people who are inevitably very high users of energy get a particular help for that. They've still got to try to reduce that, but they get particular help. And in general, that has worked very effectively. So I don't think we need to, I don't think we need to worry about that part of it. The bit that I think we do have to worry about is how we think about consumption. And one of the things that I think COVID-19 has done is that almost everybody has thought a bit about their lives over the last 4 months, frankly. I mean, sometimes quite superficially, but very often rather deeply. That's really why some people are saying, I mean, I happen to have been talking to two people or through their bosses recently. Bosses said, look, these very senior people have resigned, said they're not going to work any longer because they understood, being at home with their children, that they would prefer to have slightly less income and not pay for the childcare, but actually care for them themselves. Now, they had to learn that. I'm not saying it's right for everybody, but they learnt it. And so you can have that kind of people who say, well, I prefer to be at home because the stress and strain of commuting is not something that's doing me or the family any good. So one of the things I hope we'll do also is just to think a bit about the very simple, practical, factual things, which is that more and more doesn't make us happier and happier. That an awful lot of the stuff, the frankly crap which we buy unnecessarily, and we just got to think about that. And we've got to think about it in sensible ways. I mean, I'm a meat eater, and I believe that human beings are made to eat meat. I mean, in the sense our bodies are made to eat meat. But I'm still an enthusiast for saying that we ought to eat 20% less meat and eat better meat, because we shouldn't be growing meat in the, I think, immoral ways that we are doing at the moment. You know, I think sticking a whole lot of beef animals together and not allowing them to be outside. Some things we do to chickens are entirely unacceptable morally. So there's nothing wrong in saying, let's eat 20% less meat and let's buy better meat, because actually we probably ought to eat 20% less anything, as a matter of fact, because we're all eating too much. So it seems to me this has been an ideal moment, because so many people have said to themselves, I really rather enjoyed doing the exercise, because I started to do it when I was allowed to do one bit of exercise a day. So I thought I'd better use that up. So I did that, rather enjoyed doing that. So when I've done that, I've done some more exercise. All sorts of things. I do these things together with the family because I'm not allowed to do it with anybody else. I've learned an awful. I just think this is the moment to try to capture that and make us move forward. So that bit of consumption is, I think, crucially important.
Thanks a lot, Deben. I just want to turn, we've got about just over 10 minutes left. We've got a few questions coming in on the Q&A and on the chat and directly. Chris, if you're able to unmute Phil Horton, we've got an interesting question from our friends at the RYA. Bear with us for the technology.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi.
So yes, my question was, how embedded do you think sustainable thinking is in government? So the approach we're taking is that we need to embed sustainability throughout the organisation so that people take decisions on a day-to-day basis in a sustainable way, rather than referring to us in the sustainability team because we couldn't cope with that number of questions, essentially. So how embedded do you think that is within government now?
Oh, enormously better. I mean, this year, for the first time in our annual report, we are reporting not just on the government as a whole and the devolved governments, but also department by department. So we're reporting on the education department, the health department, the rest. And before we did that, I went round and talked to the permanent secretaries of most of them. And I have to say, there's a very different way of thinking about things today. They do understand that this has to be central. And of course, they've seen it in business. Business has led it. I don't think that the departments of government, some, but most of them haven't. It's been business leading it. They've seen business doing it, and they have also had the political pressure. So we're beginning to see really lively changes. The Ministry of Defence, for example, is doing a huge amount, and it's really noticeable how they're looking much further ahead than many. And part of the reason for that is, of course, in their planning, they've had to take climate change into account, because you can't think about what future conflicts there might be without thinking about where the droughts are going to be, and where people are going to be likely to come into conflict zones. So they're doing a great deal. I think it's now absolutely clear that all the new hospitals and all the new schools which we are promised will be done in a zero emission fashion. So that gets two more departments, really. The Department of Transport is a really remarkable change. I'm afraid under previous ministers, they were very difficult, but Grant Shapps and his chief executive permanent secretary have really changed that round. So you may have noticed he's one of the first people to announce, first of all, that they bring the date for all electric sales from 2040 to 2035. We want them to bring it even further forward, but he was the first to do that. He very soon after COVID introduced a proposition to take some money out of the roads programme for better broadband and for dealing particularly with cycle lanes and the like. So there's a very good deal of that. I think some departments are not yet as focused on it as I would like to see it. I think the most important department to get right is the housing department, because until they set proper standards for housing, we'll go on building houses that have got to be retrofitted. There are 1 million houses that we have built over the last few years, all of which will have to be retrofitted because the government didn't set the standards high enough, and because the house building industry is not prepared to do things unless it's forced.
Thank you.
Thanks, Phil. Just quickly, Chris, I noticed there was a question from Zena on the chat. It may be answered, but if you're able to unmute Zena, we can just double check that. And then there's a question from Barry that I think could be interesting. And then if there's a couple more, we can get to them, and then we'll call it a day.
Great. Can you folks hear me?
Yes, indeed.
Fabulous. Well, thank you very much, John. Really appreciate the work you're doing. So I'm from the Extinction Rebellion Cricket Club, and I was interested to hear in your report about circular economies. And you were talking about earlier about following the money. So what I find really interesting is, how do we change from a GDP driven economy to people's ideas of running a circular economy whilst achieving all these aims at the speed we need to see them?
Well, I can't pretend it's easy, but it's a very interesting series of things you brought together there, and thank you. Well, first of all, the man who invented the concept of GDP always said that it was only a partial measure of the growth of a society. All societies have to grow. Human beings need growth. What matters is how you define growth. And if you define growth on the basis of more and more things and stuff, then of course you create a society which is constantly using up the resources that it has. And there are only finite resources in this world. It's a wonderful world. I mean, the fantastic abundance of the world in which we live is amazing. But in the end, even an abundant world only has a certain amount of resource. So we have to learn to measure growth in a much wider sense, which is what the man who invented GDP said. He said that's one bit of it. Now we've got to talk about the other bits. And the circular economy is partially, of course, measured as far as money is concerned. In other words, if you build a situation in which you are reusing, where you are recycling, where you are making sure that you use to the utmost all the resources that you have, then you are in the end creating something which is bound to be cheaper once you've got the prices down, because you're all doing it. You've got to, you know, it starts out by being niche and therefore expensive, but once you're all doing it, then you've got mass production, and all those things can mean that you can bring the prices of doing this down. So first of all, we have to do that. But secondly, we have to recognize this thing that I mentioned before, and it just has to be said. It may sound pious, it may sound moralistic, but it is true. We have got to understand that all the evidence, objective evidence, is that once you have what is necessary to live relatively comfortably, you don't get happier because you've got more. What happens is you get more and you want more, and that makes you actually less happy, as a matter of fact. And you always feel you're less well off than the one above you, even if you're very well off indeed. That's one of the facts, I'm afraid, of life. So what you need to do is to have a measurement of society where you really are looking at the satisfaction index, and running your society so that people can be more satisfied. That's why I do believe in home working when people choose it. I do believe in the way in which we have been learning to work together over this period of COVID, really continuing that beyond. I do believe that I understand more about quite a lot of things because I've talked to people in their own home. Sure. When you see them with a background, I can't see your background, but I can see Dom's background, and I can see Russ's background, and you can see mine. And then when the dog walks in, or the child walks in and climbs on your knee, or in my case, grandchild comes and does that, there's a different relationship. We're beginning to have a much better relationship about the nature of the whole person and the family and the rest of it. So let's manufacture those as well. Let's press that. Let's make that more important.
Are we going to encourage the future to be less growth driven and more well-being driven?
Well, as long as I don't think more well-being is any less of a growth than more money. See, I think just we've misused the word growth. Cardinal Newman said growth is the only evidence of life, but he didn't mean by growth that getting richer was the only evidence of life. What he meant was that learning more, appreciating more, understanding more, loving more, all those things are part of growth. And when you talk about people growing up, you don't mean that they are richer. In fact, they very often are poorer. But what you mean by growing up is that they have gained things, that they have grown as people. You say, my goodness, that chap's grown. You don't mean that he's just 6'2" now instead of 5'8". What you mean is that he's grown in his appreciation and his understanding of the life. So as long as we define growth differently so that it includes well-being, then I think we have a very much better way of asserting what contributes to human happiness. But you mustn't leave the money out of it, because there are a lot of people in this country, and even more people outside, for whom the first step, frankly, is to give them a decent amount of money to live on. We really have to recognise that. Sometimes we're a bit too high moralistic about this. Some people find it very hard to put food on the table, and until we overcome that problem, they're not going to be able to grow in other ways.
Thank you very much. That's great.
Thanks for your questions, Zena. It's brilliant stuff. I'm just very conscious of time, so I'm going to invite one last question from Barry. Chris, if you're able to unmute Barry. I think, knowing Barry, there's probably going to be an element of mischief in this question, but let's see what he comes up with.
Thanks, Dom, for that setup. Always lovely to hear Lord Deben speak. Just between us, Lord Deben, nobody else is listening. What is your real take on the role of fossil fuels now in the future? Are they mischief making, or are they definitely part of the solution now? Broad question. And a quick question on, where is sports Marcus Rashford for climate, and do we need one?
Sorry, I didn't hear the second question.
Just comparing the advocacy of Marcus Rashford on school meals recently.
Yes.
Where is the big high profile voice for climate change from a sports ambassador?
Well, the answer is there isn't yet, but I say yet because there must be. I mean, it's one of the things that is really important. As far as the first question is concerned, I think we have to face the fact that fossil fuels have come to the end of their life. We're at a situation in which we can't possibly afford to dig out what we know to be there. And sensible companies like BP and quite a number of others have recognised that. It takes some time for ExxonMobil to come to understand that. That's why I personally don't ever buy Esso petrol, because I think you have to make these little steps yourself. But we won't be having fossil fuels in the form that we have today. There is no doubt that some of them will be used in specific areas in which we will take the carbon out of them, which is why we need carbon capture and storage. It's also true that gas and oil will be used as basic feedstocks for certain other things in which you're not burning them. But in general, when we reach 2050, if we're going to be net zero, there will be very little place for fossil fuels. I think there will still be some fossil fuels for aviation. It's taking a very long time to find an alternative to that. But in general, I think by that time, we will be traveling around the world in shipping which is not driven by fossil fuels. I think we will have got into the hydrogen economy. And I think we will have found ways in which you can make hydrogen without using fossil fuels and without using the amount of energy you now have to use. So there isn't a future for it, but that doesn't mean to say they don't have to transition. So I'm not a believer in the concept of disinvestment in fossil fuel companies. I'm in the believer of helping fossil fuel companies to make the transition to the new world. And that's what we should do. And what I hope is that in the new world, some of the great companies in which people's pensions are invested and the like, some of those great companies will still be great companies, but they will be doing other things and they will not be producing oil and gas.
Great, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for the questions. It's 2 minutes past 3. We've taken up a fair amount of your afternoon, Lord Deben. I'm sure we could go on for hours more, and I'm sure this isn't the last time that we'll speak. But I think on behalf of everybody on the call, we'd like to thank you for taking the time, for sharing your perspectives and your wisdom and experience, and not least for managing to get Cardinal Newman, a papal encyclical, Everton Football Club, Coca Cola, the 8 remaining climate skeptic parliamentarians, and the future of the world all into one webinar session. It was absolutely a rich discussion. It's going to be available for people to watch back. I'm sure they'll want to do so. So we'd like to thank you all. And at 3 minutes past 3 now, we'll bring this to a close, and I'll let you know that England are currently 3-1 in the 5th over of the new normal when it comes to cricket. So I'm sure you're all eager to go and watch it, and I wish you all a good afternoon. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for it.